We set out to determine 4 things: the cost to taxpayers in Illinois, the cost to victims, the causes of these wrongful convictions, because if we don't know what causes them, we can't recommend reforms. And lastly, we set out to determine the cost to society, the cost to the community of leaving the right person on the street while the wrong man or woman was in prison. The cost to taxpayers. To establish the cost to taxpayers, we added up the cost of incarceration in county jails and in the Illinois Department of Corrections, the cost of civil litigation, and the total payments by the Illinois Court of Claims for wrongful conviction. We didn't factor in the costs of prosecution, believing it to be somewhat of a fixed cost, although frankly it's much more likely to be, it's much more costly to convict an innocent person than a guilty one. A guilty man is more likely to take a plea deal, less likely to appeal, less likely to have multiple trials, as a large number of our exonerees did. These calculations were difficult. I won't belabor this point, but I want to point out 2 things. One is several county jails don't keep separate budgets for their jail operation. They're under the sheriff's budget. In that case, we had to use a cost figure for those particular county jails that's based on the average cost of the jails who could provide us with information. And then if you consider the difficulty of calculating the cost of incarceration of every individual, no one entered on January 1st of one year and left on December 31st of a subsequent year. So we had to calculate for each individual precisely how many days they had served, and then factor in what the operating cost of the IDOC was for both the full years and the partial years. And we had to do the same for county jails. And as some prisoners had multiple trials, they were in and out of county jails and the IDOC several times. For help, we were able to tap senior consultants at Navigant, who donated their time and compiled an extraordinary spreadsheet for us that even factored in the extra days in leap years. And this is just a small portion of their work, but it gives you some idea of the complexity of the calculations. The total cost to taxpayers turned out to be $214 million. We think this is a highly conservative figure. It does not reflect many costs of prosecution of the innocent, nor does it reflect the higher cost of incarcerating prisoners on death row and in high security institutions. We used an average IDOC cost of incarceration. Nor does it reflect the many civil suits that are now in process. Nor does it reflect any wrongful arrest cases like the infamous case of Kevin Fox, wrongfully arrested for killing his daughter, which cost taxpayers $8 million. We think that if recent trends in judgments and settlements continue, the total cost to taxpayers will surpass $300 million in the next several years, as 16 civil suits now in process and a 17th soon to be filed are settled or come to trial. The cost to victims was equally immense. 85 exonerees spent 926 years in prison. But more than 9 centuries of wasted life doesn't begin to measure the cost of these 83 men and 2 women. No spreadsheet can total the cost of marriages broken, the cost of children left without a parent, the cost of exonerees emerging, not knowing how to operate a cell phone with outdated skills. I spoke to one who was baffled by a shower handle. When he'd gone into prison, there were 2. Now there was 1. He couldn't figure it out. Another whose 10-year-old son had no idea who he was. A third who went in as a competent mechanic on cars from the 1980s and who's now afraid to touch a car because he doesn't know how they operate, with these now operate, of course, by computers. With a 10 or 20-year gap in their resume, these men and women are hardly attractive to potential employers. Because the goal for everybody is to, because the goal for everyone is to reform this, we had to look at what the causes of wrongful conviction are. They're typically ineffective assistance of counsel, questionable forensic evidence or testimony, incentivized witness testimony. This is typically a jailhouse informant or someone who testifies for the prosecution in exchange for some benefit, a lighter sentence, a reward, sometimes some kind of monetary payment. False confessions. The suspect confesses even though he or she hasn't committed the crime, sometimes as a result of coercion, sometimes mental illness is involved, sometimes it's an attempt to escape from a hopeless or high-pressure situation. Prosecutorial misconduct or error, erroneous eyewitness identification, and police misconduct or error round out the typical causes. And you could have multiple causes within the same case. The man on the left here speaks to the problem of eyewitness misidentification, which is the leading cause of wrongful conviction, and we thought that was going to be the outcome of our study as well. This is Patrick McCaughan. He was arrested for armed robbery on the North Shore. He was called the wedding ring bandit for holding up women and demanding their wedding rings. So if you look at the dark orange bars here, these are all government-driven factors. And again, you can have multiple causes within a single case. Now, why these results were different than others is because we think our sample was different than other samples. Most of the studies of wrongful conviction are based on studies in which DNA has cleared someone. And of those cases, many are sexual assault cases in which the victim survived and may or may not have misidentified the perpetrator. Our sample of 85 cases included only 32 DNA exonerations, so less than half. Many of ours were murders in which the chief witness was dead and thus unavailable to make an eyewitness identification. And the people in our sample were mostly exonerated by non-scientific means. The real criminal was caught or confessed, other physical evidence was uncovered, witnesses recanted, a new alibi came to light, judges found insufficient evidence, and in some cases the prosecution dropped charges. Our last calculation was to determine as best we could the cost to society, the cost to the community of leaving the right guy on the street while the wrong man or woman was inside. I want to tell you just one story about that. This is Jerry Miller. In 1982, he was 1 year out of the Army. He'd worked as a cook in the Army. He was looking for a job. He looked for a job up in Lincoln Park because he'd been a cook up there. And he was stopped by two police officers who asked him what he was doing. He took down his name, address, and 5 days later, a woman was raped in a parking garage in downtown Chicago, raped and kidnapped, put in a car trunk. And the composite sketch, when the police officers saw it, they thought it resembled this guy they'd stopped a few days earlier. So they brought him down to the police station and took his picture. As you can see, he's wearing a hairnet. The victim described her perpetrator as having worn a hairnet, and they had Miller don one, and they used this photo in the photo array. Now, we think it's highly unlikely that they had 4 other photos of men in hairnets, but we don't know because the photo array was not preserved. Strikingly, the victim did not pick Miller out. She picked out 2 other men as possible perpetrators. But in a lineup, one of the cashiers at the parking lot where the rape took place identified Miller, and a second cashier made a tentative identification. And when it came time for trial, both of those cashiers were certain, and the victim said that Miller looked like her perpetrator. Because it was such a brutal crime and involved the kidnapping, he got a sentence of 52 years. He served 26 years in prison and on parole. And after his release, he had to register his name, photograph, and physical description on the state's registered sex offender website. He was required to attend and pay for sex offender classes, prohibited from jobs that had contact with children, and from living with any family member who had children, and he was forbidden to answer his door on Halloween. This is the actual perpetrator. His name is Robert Weeks. During the 26 years that Miller was serving Weeks' prison time, Weeks attacked 4 other women, at least 4, raping 3. He was stopped before raping the 4th by a passerby. He committed aggravated battery on 11 police officers. And he attacked a man with a chain in an unsuccessful attempt to steal his watch, according to police and court records. Those documents indicate that the injuries to the 4 women raped raped and attempted rape, included a broken cheekbone, a broken nose, a broken orbital bone, a broken wrist, and lacerations, contusions, and hematomas to one woman's face, neck, ribs, and legs. 3 of the police officers required hospital treatment. By the time Miller was cleared by DNA testing in 2007, it was too late to prosecute Weeks for the 1982 rape, but he was prosecuted for some of the others, and he's now serving natural life without parole. So back to the big picture. We examined court records, judicial opinions, and press accounts in order to document the total number of felonies committed by all of the culprits, and this is what we found. 14 murders, 11 sexual assaults, 10 kidnappings, 19 armed robberies, and 43 other felonies, which include attempted murder of federal officers, aggravated battery, and various narcotic offenses. Total of 97 felonies. And this is without doubt, Rob and I think, a vast underestimate, because we don't know who the real culprit was in more than 30 of our cases, and because we cannot document all the crimes that some of these known culprits committed and got away with. We stuck with the convictions, of course. So, summing up, 85 cases. We had 81 cases alleged government misconduct or error, 926 years in prison, cost to taxpayers $214 million. I'd like to leave you with one thought about how common wrongful conviction is. Rob spoke eloquently to this at the press conference a few minutes ago. You'll recall that I mentioned the case of Patrick McCaughan, wrongfully convicted of being the wedding ring bandit, and Darrell Cameron, wrongfully convicted of armed robbery. Both were eyewitness misidentification cases, but what makes them important here is that these are the only 2 exonerees in our study who were convicted solely of armed robbery. That is, armed robbery without a rape or murder involved, so no science involved in these cases. And both of these men were exonerated because of a total fluke. In McCaughan's case, it happened because a Highland Park police detective was dragged to a party given by his wife's office. And while he was there, he happened to meet a guy who also was dragged there, who was a jeweler. And the jeweler said to the officer, "What do you do for a living?" And the officer said, "I'm a police detective." And the jeweler said, "Oh, that's interesting. I just talked to a police detective from Arizona. He called me because some guy down there is holding up women and stealing their wedding rings. And my name was in the guy's book because he thought he might be able to pawn the rings with me." The guy from Highland Park goes down there. Zarowski basically confesses to the crimes that McCaughan is serving for, and McCaughan gets out. And in Cameron's case, he got lucky because his defense attorney was Tommy Brewer, now Judge Brewer, and as you probably know, a former FBI agent. And Brewer figured that if his client didn't do the crime, somebody did. He combed through a collection of police reports on armed robberies, found some of the same kind, identified Charles Bell, went to see Bell in prison, and Bell confessed and told Brewer that not only was he confessing to him, but he'd also told prosecutors the same thing. Brewer was able to get his client freed in the time between conviction and sentencing. So I mentioned these 2 alleged armed robbers misidentified by witnesses to make a particular point. Armed robberies are far more common than rapes or murders. They typically involve no DNA evidence. Convictions are often based on erroneous eyewitness misidentification. We would argue that we're convicting a lot of innocent people misidentified by witnesses who have no chance of getting cleared by science. And the state could follow the lead of other cities and states and institute reforms that wouldn't eliminate all of these causes of wrongful conviction, but could reduce them considerably. Thank you very much.